Welcome to Biblio Files, the program on AADL TV, where we take 5 minutes to answer one question each week about books. I'm here with Christopher and Amanda. My name is Lucy, and this week's question is, what author have you read all or most of their works? So, Christopher, who's that author for you?
So I thought that I had read all of John Krakauer's books, but just this morning I realized he has a new book out. I'm crazy about John Krakauer. Probably a lot of people know Into Thin Air, and there's also Where Men Win Glory. Krakauer is an amazing writer. He writes very exciting nonfiction stories, but the reason I love him so much is that he treats his subjects with so much respect. And I really had very little interest in Pat Tillman, the NFL, or really in Afghanistan. That's not a part of the world that particularly interests me, but I bought this book just because it was a Krakauer book, and he didn't disappoint. One of his latest books is Missoula, and that was such a great book. I heard him speak on NPR. He's a great speaker. Missoula is a chilling and enraging book all about campus rape and football. He's such a great writer. And as I said, I thought I had read all of his books, but he has a new book of collected essays out that I just discovered this morning. So that's going to be on my list. All right. Amanda?
So one of the authors that I've read most or all of the works by is an author I've already mentioned on the show. So I don't know if we're allowed to do that, but the authors that I've read the most of or all of are things I've already mentioned. My author is David Sedaris. I've read all of his published books. I've read some of his short stories that are available online and some of the publications that he writes for. I feel like he's an author I don't even need to tell you about, but David Sedaris, he writes nonfiction. Most of them are memoirs and stories and things that happened to him and his family and his partner. He talks about his childhood. The first book I read by him was Me Talk Pretty One Day, and his most recent book, Calypso. And I actually didn't meet him until he published Calypso, and I went to the bookstore and I got to meet him for the first time. And he's a really fun author to meet because he really talks to you and he loves talking to his readers, which is pretty cool. But he's just such a neat guy, and I love reading the stories that are really rooted like with deep heart in his family. And in between me reading Me Talk Pretty One Day and then the most recent one, Calypso, there are a lot of other books in between. And what I liked about his most recent book, Calypso, is he really got down to more of like the deeper, really, really heartfelt stuff with his family again. And I just really enjoyed it as a read. It was really, really cool. But his books are hilarious. He writes with such this deadpan, like dry. It's just so funny. He can talk about anything and he can just make it adventurous and funny and dear, like picking up trash along the road on these really, really long walks. It just sounds so mesmerizing when he talks about it. And listening to his books on audio are really great. I like listening to some of them, just having them on in the background. I like rereading some short stories by him, specific ones on audio just because they're fun. Holiday Isn't Ice is another one that's really fun. There's a lot of fun stories in there. His books are just hilarious, and I will read anything he publishes. So there you go, David Sedaris. Lucy?
So like you, I'm also going to mention an author that I've already talked about, but the author whose books I've read all or most of is Toni Morrison, and I have actually read all of her fiction at least once for everything, and then I've read one of her plays, and I have read maybe one of her books of nonfiction, and part of a second one. But she wrote 12 novels, and I have read them all. And one thing that I love about reading all of what an author writes is that I felt like, especially with Toni Morrison, starting with her first novel, The Bluest Eye, and then her last novel was called God Help the Child. And when I finished God Help the Child, I felt like I was still getting part of the conversation that she'd started in The Bluest Eye. Like, I feel like it's almost like this stack of blocks, you know, and each book kind of informs the next one. And she actually did write what she called a conceptual trilogy. So Beloved, which is probably the book she's known the most for, and the book I already talked about on this series, was the first in a trilogy. The second books were called Jazz and then Paradise. Not the same characters, not the same time period, but just those same concepts running throughout. So I think that's, as I said before, something that's really cool about when you find an author and you want to read everything that they wrote, that you kind of see how they have the same things running throughout their books, how they change. It's a cool exercise. So that is Toni Morrison. So we hope that you will comment. There's a link below that will let you comment to let us know if there's an author whose works you've read all of or most of. And we hope also that you will join us next time for Biblio Files when we talk about the scariest book that we have ever read. Thank you for joining us.